Hi everyone, this is Miriam Nami from Newcastle University and the Alan Turing Institute. Welcome to the Smart Charging webinar. Today we will be talking about experience from California on integrating plug-in electric vehicles with the grid. The aim of this webinar is to know who's doing what on smart charging, so to collaborate when possible on rolling out future-proof and fit-for-purpose charging infrastructure. This is especially important in the UK right now, where we have a lot of development happening. Policy-wise, last year, government introduced the Automated and Electric Vehicle Act that gives it power to introduce secondary legislation. We just finished the consultation process. It's closed, and now government is processing it, and it will inform regulations that will come in 2020 on smart charging. In the UK, we have a target of all new cars and vans to be zero emission by 2040, and government introduced several ways to support this. One of them is a 400 million charging infrastructure investment fund to roll out mainly fast chargers. But also there is a £30 million for vehicle-to-grid technology. On the webinar, we've been having talks on communication protocols and standards that are necessary for successful vehicle grid integration. So we spoke about ISO 15118, we spoke about OCPP. Also, we had another set of topics where companies shared their experience on actually implementing some of these protocols. So for example, we had a company in the Netherlands using OCPP for smart charging, a company in the UK using OCPP and OpenADR for smart charging. The slides and videos from the webinars are available on YouTube and on landing page. The first webinar in January will also be on a communication protocol. So we will have Paul Bertrand speaking about IEC 63110. IEC 63110 is supposed to be the official standard version, maybe, of OCPP, but again, we'll wait for that webinar to know. Two more slides from me. This webinar is an activity of the Vehicle Grid Integration Group at the Alan Turing Institute, which is the Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence in the UK, and it is also an activity of the Supergen Energy Networks hosted by Newcastle University. Noel Crisostomo today from California Energy Commission is going to talk to us about experiences from California. The target in California is for 5 million zero-emission vehicles by 2030, and the California Energy Commission is responsible to assess the required charging infrastructure, and we will hear from Noel about this. Before taking post at California Energy Commission, Noel was the lead utilities regulatory analyst at the California Public Utility Commission, where he managed investor-owned utility design for electric vehicle programs in charging infrastructure, low carbon fuel standard, and demonstrations on vehicle grid integration. So with that, I'll hand over to Noel.
Hi, Miriam. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can see your screen. Thank you.
Great. Well, I want to appreciate and thank your invitation to share lessons learned from California on vehicle grid integration, and would welcome comments after the slides. I've allocated about 40 minutes for presentation so that we can have some Q&A at the end. As Miriam mentioned, I'll be discussing our efforts to integrate plug-in electric vehicles with the grid, taking a look at our modeling analysis to understand the network design requirements, as well as smart charging technology designs that have been learned from our investments in research and deployment. So first, some context on the policy arena in California. California has to electrify its transportation in order to meet climate and air quality goals. California has among the most ambitious climate change mitigation and clean air targets globally. And last year, our former Governor Brown had set goals to decarbonize the economy by 2045. To achieve this level of greenhouse gas emissions reduction, the state must address the transportation sector, because when accounting for direct emissions, combustion use, and oil and gas, transportation accounts for half of the state's greenhouse gas footprint, with a quarter of emissions coming from light-duty vehicles, which will be the focus of this presentation. To reduce these emissions, the state has set targets for 5 million zero-emission vehicles by 2030, and to lay the groundwork for this goal, the state directed the deployment of 250,000 chargers by 2025, including 10,000 DC fast chargers, which will be described later. And this count pertains to EV chargers meeting an interim target of 1.5 million zero-emission vehicles by 2025. Additional charging infrastructure will be needed to address the truck, bus, and off-road vehicle sector. And while these populations are smaller, they contribute a disproportionate amount of air pollutants that will need to transition to zero emission to meet the state compliance with federal Clean Air Act mandates. Planning for charging infrastructure has been a critical piece of decarbonizing transportation, and the Energy Commission has been instrumental in establishing regional capacities to prepare for charging, and in establishing a statewide analytical effort that sends both the markets and utilities signals to construct necessary infrastructure. One of the directives that we're responsible for implementing was establishing benchmarks to ensure that there's sufficient infrastructure for the widespread deployment and adoption of electric vehicles. This executive order manifested itself in more practical questions for planners and local governments who needed to know what types of charging were needed, where, and how that might change with changes in technology and adoption over time. So my former colleague, Dr. Kadir Badir, took on this challenge to build a tool to answer this question. How many of each type of charger are needed in California to ensure that battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles could drive mostly on electricity by 2025? And the goals were fourfold: to enable both BEVs and PHEVs to travel throughout the state, especially give PHEVs the opportunity to travel without consuming gasoline. And third, to plan for widespread adoption and market growth beyond early adopters that were focused in metropolitan areas in large cities. And then fourth, and which is the area where EVI Pro specializes, to consider drivers' ability to reduce the size and thus cost of the network by sharing common infrastructure. The Energy Commission worked with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to build a modeling framework, which we call the Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Projections Tool, to answer these questions, which is summarized in the system diagram. Fundamentally, EVI Pro is a sequence of travel demand and energy supply simulations and analyses that solve for a network of chargers required at different locations, home, work, and the public, and power capacities, level 1, level 2, or DC fast. This intends to support a population of travelers within a given region, specifically counties, of which there are 58 in California. The key intention of the EVI Pro tool is to quantify the various factors affecting infrastructure network demand, including technology and user behavior, and key aspects of the model framework include: first, pursuing a charging solution that supports mass market adoption without modifying travel schedules; characterizing vehicle technologies with improvements over time; characterizing infrastructure with increasing charge power and availability of charging at home, as well as driver price and time preferences; accounting for chargers, changes in the market for different types of EVs, BEVs or PHEV EVs; analyzing infrastructure solutions to meet equitable deployment goals by, for example, converging from EV adoption levels today in certain areas to overall new car adoption in which EVs are adopted across all counties, and by modeling fleet growth linearly instead of exponentially so that the market can build the infrastructure in advance of actual adoption. And then last, considering a range in the size of the charger network with a low amount of the network based on the peak coincidence of charging sessions and the high range of the network based on the ability to efficiently site a charger where it could be used multiple times per day by several drivers. The ultimate result of this modeling analysis is a quantification of how many chargers are needed to support electric vehicle adoption in the 58 counties across California from 2017 to 2025, which was the original period of the analysis. To review some high-level findings of the work, 83% of the users, drivers in the roughly 1.5 million vehicles model was able to charge at single-family homes. At least 66,000 electric vehicles could not complete travel with simply level 1 chargers, meaning there was a need for level 2. The remainder, or 1.1 million electric vehicles, could technically meet the travel demand with just level 1 chargers. 9% of charging users resided at multi-unit dwellings, resulting in 121,000 chargers. At least 7,000 EVs living at multi-unit dwellings needed level 2 chargers, and the remainder could technically meet their need with level 1 chargers. 8% of the population charged elsewhere at non-residential locations only. These included at a demand for charging at 10,000 DC fast chargers and 120,000 workplace charging stations and destination centers or public sites. It's notable with this bar chart that over 80% of the level 2 charging demand in the public destination sector comes from displacing the oil consumption from relatively low-range PHEVs. So there was high sensitivity to meeting the electric vehicle miles travel objective. All the county-level results, including charger counts, growth trajectories, and load curves, which we'll return to later in this deck, are located on a results viewer available at maps.nrel.gov/CEC, and these slides will be available after the talk. Additional details about the methodology are included in an hour-long tutorial just on EVI Pro, linked at the YouTube screenshot, which is hyperlinked. Before returning to load profiles and discussing smart charging in the second part of my talk, I want to highlight an important point in infrastructure modeling with respect to the use of connector ratios, which are commonly used as rules of thumb to quantify the level of chargers needed for a given population of electric vehicles. The modeled results shown here demonstrate that connector ratios can vary widely and are based on travel patterns and housing type. So on this graph, the x-axis displays a portion of the residents in a county that are assumed to not have a home charger. And this population is principally driven by the number of small apartment buildings, less than 5 units, within the county, and other residents of mobile homes or users of boats, RVs, and vans. The y-axis displays the number of BEVs deployed in the county in 2025, indexed to the deployment of DC fast chargers solved by the EVI Pro tool. To illustrate this variation, it's useful to isolate vehicle charging technology, where in EVI Pro, we assumed that only BEVs would use DC fast chargers, since for level 2 chargers, there might be some commingling of users that are driving both battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. And each dot represents a specific one of the 58 counties in California. So given this wide variation, given this normalization, there's a wide variation in the EV to EVSE ratio. As a factor of 9 shows the full range of counties' connector ratios. And it's kind of illustrated by the inconclusive pattern in the scatter plot. However, when grouping the counties by local planning regions, we're able to illustrate a stronger relationship where as the number of apartments increases, the number of BEVs a single DC fast charger can serve decreases. This is intuitive because as home charging is unavailable because the apartment is unable to guarantee a parking space or requires on-street parking, those drivers must then turn to public chargers that are available to them. A last result from EVI Pro is to highlight the charging load profile. As shown before in the system diagram, the EV energy consumption is calculated as an intermediate result in order to quantify how charging sessions coincide, which informs the size of the total network. In California, we call this load profile the EV charging dragon curve in order for us to illustrate and be wary of the potential demand resulting from an uncontrolled charging situation. The first part of this curve is the rise in workplace charging, as people without home charging or with long commutes drive to work and start to plug in, where demand is peaking at around 9 a.m. The second part is relatively constant demand for public charging during waking hours for drivers without home charging, or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles that need an opportunity to charge to maximize their electric range. Specifically for public charging, public DC fast chargers experience an undulating demand during this time, which is a reflection of the twice-hourly departure and arrival times of the surveyed California drivers and the relatively higher charging power that we assumed for DC fast chargers. Some of this ripple effect observed in green is partially attributed to the rounding of time that drivers may have used in keeping their travel diary and the 10-minute resolution used to bin the EVI Pro charging algorithm. Most important in this shape is the associated weighted loads from charging at home. Between the hours of 4 and 7 p.m., which is the peak period for the grid in California as its solar resources are setting, work commuters are also arriving home and plugging in. During these 3 hours, 500 megawatts of additional charging load is added, with 75% of this ramp associated with level 1 charging, which results in an overall peak charging demand of nearly 1 gigawatt of new load added at 8 p.m. With this uncontrolled charging, additional and costly natural gas ramping generation could be needed. However, with smart charging, we'd like to tame this dragon curve to assist in renewables integration instead of additional costs to the system. Examining charging load and other electric sector trends is important to set the stage for California's efforts in smart charging. As a result of climate change, even coastal cities are now needing more air conditioning. For example, on the left-hand graph, in the past 30 years, air conditioning in the coastal regions of Southern California have grown more than the increase in demand for air conditioning in the inland or desert regions, with a 36 percentage point increase in the past 30 years since 1985. The effect of this heating is stressing aging distribution systems. The blackout pictured here is a result of the record heat wave last year, which caused high air conditioning demand that persisted into the night. This heat overloaded transformers as customers returned home and turned on their AC and potentially charged their cars, leaving ultimately over 100,000 customers without power. This graph from our transmission system operator, third to the right, provides a snapshot of the costs to operate the grid with the famous California duck curve, which represents the diurnal decrease in net load associated with solar energy. As noted earlier, you can see prices go essentially vertically during the evening ramping hours of 4 to 7 p.m. associated with the need to start conventional generators as solar as the solar resource is set. And this last chart shows that even if society is able to peak emissions in 2040 and reduce them thereafter, air conditioning demand will continue to grow, which is represented here by a 50% increase in the number of cooling degree days in Los Angeles County. I will note that this scenario is based on a relative concentration pathway of 4.5, which is in excess of California's goals for carbon neutrality by 2045. In addition to these challenges, we must also prepare for instances where large sections of the grid are shut down in order to reduce the risk of wildfire, which is also exacerbated by climate change. And so the resulting public safety power shutoff program, which is illustrated by my photo of an empty rack of batteries in a blacked out grocery store, is emblematic of the need to be more robust in our resiliency of planning if we intend to decarbonize our transportation system based on renewable electricity. This has catalyzed public interest to find ways to tap energy from their EV battery. So, thus, the state is working diligently on vehicle to grid, especially with respect to interconnection of AC charging systems or mobile batteries based V2G instead of DC V2G. Addressing these challenges together of grid aging, heat waves, distribution stress, wholesale pricing, motivates the Energy Commission to advance the deployment of smart charging today and lay the groundwork for vehicle to grid. A common challenge observed in California and the United Kingdom regards the design of charging systems to make sure that they are interoperable and demand responsive. And while earlier I was emphasizing the importance of designing charging infrastructure for local needs, it's critical to highlight the imperative where EV charging systems and EV charging programs and incentives avoid fragmenting the customer experience because EVs naturally move across cities, charging networks, and utility territories. Today, California programs face the issue that highly specialized local or utility program designs could contrast the goals of manufacturers, whether it be automotive manufacturers or electrical manufacturers, which is to increase production so that the usefulness of a given investment can approach profitability through economies of scale. The European Commission Joint Research Center and the U.S. Department of Energy highlight this vision for charging, where instead of differentiation, harmonization, and compatibility are key. So global interoperability is where any PEV can plug into any charger, anywhere, anytime, and both devices are able to function without any special effort by the user. The use of codes and standards is important for this. It'll enable and provide automotive and charging manufacturers the signals that they need to achieve profitable economies of scale. In the next few slides, I'll highlight several codes and standards that our analysis has found to be critical enablers of interoperability. Instead of focusing on any one in great depth, and given the number of expert speakers who have offered their insights on the technical designs and operations and use cases of these standards, I'll highlight the EVSE as a nexus point connecting various systems and focus on points about costs and benefits of networked charging and high-level communications. For the past 10 years, the Energy Commission has invested in advancing smart and efficient EV charging technology. The research and development efforts were conducted on behalf of California ratepayers via the Public Interest Energy Research Program, and now through its successor, the Electric Program Investment Charge Program. And on deployment sides, the Alternative and Renewable Fuel and Vehicle Technology Program, now known as the Clean Transportation Program, conducts demonstration and widespread dispersion of these technologies at a wide scale. In this slide, I illustrate some key attributes of an archetypical smart EVSE in 3 parts. First, the EVSE to network backend, which is able to connect the charger with various actors, including utilities at the distribution system or independent aggregators, where an EVSP or an automaker might serve that role. Second, the EVSE to electric vehicle charging interface. And then third, the core design of the EVSE. This third part is being affected through a combination of funding eligibility requirements at the Energy Commission utilities, and other agencies whose regulations are designed to maximize energy efficiency, ensure safety, securely measure energy dispensed to the vehicle, and to allow for easy payment if it is publicly available. One point to highlight, since the Automated and Electric Vehicles Bill requires the EVSE to have the ability to record consumption, is that our sister agency, the California Department of Food and Agriculture, has proposed an EVSE regulation. The intent of this regulation is to ensure that any EVSEs used in commercial sales are handling those sales with integrity, and that they're dispensing the energy that they are actually promising. They are proposing to adopt the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, Handbook 44, Section 3.40, regarding EV fueling systems, or at least parts of it, including, among others, terms about acceptance tolerances of 1% for both AC EVSE installed beginning in 2021 and DC EVSE beginning in 2033. While higher accuracy class meters are being developed for DC charging systems, the regulation in the interim calls for 2.5% accurate DC EVSE beginning in 2023. Turning to the EVSE to network protocols and building on the prior webinars focused on OpenADR, Open Charge Point Protocol, I especially want to emphasize the importance of how open, standards-based network communications provide both implementation flexibility and load flexibility. In lieu of describing these in detail, I'd recommend watching the other webinars, which are excellent resources and dedicate an hour just on each of these technologies. But to illustrate, the draft 2018 NIST New Smart Grid Interfaces Categories Assessment well illustrates this point, where NIST describes that for a high DER penetration scenario, quote, a modernized grid would likely have to accommodate new types of communications interfaces, including new interfaces for new entities, new interfaces between subsystems, and new interfaces for legacy systems. The networking options shown here demonstrate the multiple viable uses of protocols dependent on the purpose and situation for each individual EVSE. In orange, for example, OpenADR could be used for a utility direct load control effort with or without an energy management system. Or third, marked by 3, could be sent via an API connection to an EV service provider or an automaker serving as an independent aggregator of charging systems. In yellow, inter-network communications protocols like the Open Charge Point Interface or the Open Intercharge Protocol could be used to allow for inter-network billing based on the respective bilateral or hub-based information exchanges to allow for roaming for vehicles across territories or across networks. And then finally, in green, equipment management protocols like OCPP or the pending IEC 63110 can assist with protecting the EVSE as a transferable asset to reduce vendor risk and eventually increase the competitiveness of the EV market via the creation of new business models. For example, being able to sell equipment and services separately. However, while I illustrate the great range of flexibility inherent in implementing these technologies, the most crucial element comes from the ability to translate these varied data objects from various sources into information that the vehicle can act upon and understand. This is where high-level communications that enhance the existing EV charger interface become useful. High-level communications allow for digital communication of driver authentication credentials and automate the transfer and renegotiation of transaction details like pricing and payment, and information to coordinate smart vehicle charging with other actors in the system, like site hosts and EVSE networks. ISO 15118 enables the EVSE to act as a controller and to associate with the electric vehicle controller. This allows for signal level attenuation characterization, to avoid signal noise in arrays where multiple EVs and EVSEs may be charging. Acting as a pair, the EV and EV service equipment are able to automate transactions. Of principal interest today is automating the exchange of smart charging control data, which, as I will show later, maximizes site demand reduction potential while respecting driver needs. During the webinar on ISO 15118, Miriam asked which automakers are implementing ISO 15118 and where. While it is commonplace in Europe and even South Korea and pending in India, there are at least 9 automakers that have made public statements that they are currently deploying or planning to deploy electric vehicles with a version of ISO 15118. Currently, the Energy Commission is actively working with 11 electric vehicle supply equipment manufacturers and service providers as we consider the design of the next generation of charging systems eligible for our incentives under the California Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Project, or CALI-VIP for short. We would like to make sure that the infrastructure that we are deploying soon is ready for the electric vehicles soon to be rolling off of assembly lines or already operating without infrastructure that can understand the language that they would like to speak. Thus, implementing a common and unique EV to EVSE communications protocol based on ISO 15118 for J1772 is crucial for seamless charging interoperability to reduce EVSP manufacturer, memory, and network software development costs, as well as site hosts utility operational costs or needs for additional equipment. ISO 15118 also has the added benefit of improvements to the standards that continue, which include wireless charging, vehicle-to-grid, and other forms of charging, illustrated by Electrify America and BMW in this graphic, for the various types of additional services possible with this smart charging technology. I'll spend my last 4 slides on implementation costs and benefits, since the consultation Miriam mentioned had questions on that topic. Note that as a regulatory agency conducting similar analysis as the purveyor of that consultation, the Office of Low-Emission Vehicles, I'll be the first to admit that engineering and supply chain resource asymmetries are extremely challenging, especially when California is among the first jurisdictions conducting these types of market analyses and is engaging with private businesses that are continuing to advance technology but also make a profit. So I often get the question, is a smart charger worth the extra cost? However, that presupposes that there is actually a cost premium and insinuates that the premium exists across all sectors. Bulleted on this slide, I suggest that analyses of smart charging be closely examined, and I conclude that a premium does not inherently exist, at least for residential wall boxes with Wi-Fi communications. First, a cost analysis should be careful to make sure to segment out smart features that are often commingled with modules that are bundled for commercial or public-facing operations. These additional holsters, screens, payment interfaces, cord managers, etc., can quickly add costs that are necessary for usability, but are distinct from the quote, marginal cost for smart charging. Second, it is critical to benchmark the analysis among specific parameters so that the product is substantially similar and the functional unit is the same. So I assert here that normalizing for ampacity is more important than the common normalization, for example, by, quote, one level 2 port. Shown on the left, I compare a level 2 charger, a range of level 2 chargers that can be purchased online, for example, at Home Depot, Amazon, or from manufacturers' websites directly, that operate in the 30 to 40 amp range and have 20 to 25 foot cord lengths. And so the per amp costs of networked and non-networked EVSEs are competitive on a first cost basis. Lastly, this finding of cost parity is especially true when excluding outlying models in the $25 per amp range, or excluding models which were introduced early in the market or are not currently widely popular. So if possible, it's important to leverage sales data and weight according to weight according to actual sales if it's available. But to my knowledge, there is no reliable public source of sales data on residential EVSE in the industry. This next graph illustrates regression supply curves that we developed for the home-plugged GreenPhi transceivers that are necessary to enable bidirectional communications for ISO 15118 from 2 of the 3 chip manufacturers developing home-plugged GreenPhi transceivers. The third, MSTAR, which was shown in Mark Michelin's from V2G Clarity's webinar on ISO 15118, did not respond to my request for information last March when this analysis was conducted. The 2 transceiver designs vary depending on whether a microcontroller is combined with a home-plugged GreenPhi integrated circuit. And so, for example, for a volume of 10,000 units of the ST2100, the cost of the transceiver is conservatively $10 per unit. Assuming that the level 2 charger is otherwise networked with a microcontroller necessary for onboard computations and charging controls, the marginal cost of the home-plugged GreenPhi itself is about $1.5 per unit. This question about the cost of enabling bidirectional communication and smart charging communication beyond beyond networked charging has been a regulatory question in California for several years. And so understanding that, at least from a hardware standpoint, that the cost is de minimis is important for our incentive and regulation design. So in the next 2 charts, I estimate the cost benefit of implementing high-level communications to the manufacturer and the EV driver. The upper chart shows the range of increases to the costs of goods sold for level 2 EVSE, depending on the transceiver implementation designs for the ST2100 and the Qualcomm QC7000 with an ARM microcontroller. While this analysis excludes the design, engineering, software integration, and supply chain impacts that are necessary to incorporate this additional chip into the design of the EVSE, which are challenging to calculate and extremely manufacturer specific, this economies of scale analysis is illustrative. Using the supply curves, we can show that with economies of scale production, we're able to render the cost of the transceiver to be de minimis. The lower graph shows the net first cost value that considers a driver's willingness to pay, willingness to pay for the benefit of features of a charger with high-level communication, net of the component cost shown above for the high-level communication transceiver. Researchers in Germany, Geske and Schumann, surveyed real EV drivers to determine their willingness to pay for a charge computer that would essentially ensure energy and departure time requirements were met and not violated in an energy optimization for smart charging. This report from 2008 was shown to estimate that the willingness to pay ranged from over $10 to nearly $50. And so when taking the net cost, subtracting the component cost from the driver willingness to pay, the tick marks show that even using conservative assumptions of driver willingness to pay and the more expensive Qualcomm and ARM transceiver design could pay off for OEMs at less than 1,000 units sold. Again, of course, this excludes proprietary information about software design and non-recurring engineering, which is hard to reverse engineer with any set of accuracy, especially given that the cost of these goods are dependent on a manufacturer's go-to-market strategy. However, I should also emphasize that these plots exclude additional utility operational cost savings from the ability to more precisely manage charging demand, as I will explain next. I'd like everyone to recall that high-level communications is a critical enabler for the goal for global interoperability, where any EV can plug into any charger, anywhere, anytime, and both devices are able to function without special effort by the user. This suite of results shown on the slide are from 4 similar smart charging pilots in the United States, 3 of which are in California and funded by the Energy Commission, which demonstrate the importance of reducing manual inputs in order to give customers a seamless charging experience and to maximize the demand reduction potential at a site. The hypothesis that drivers want low costs but don't really want to deal with complicated interactions comes from research at the Honda workplace charging installation in Torrance. Customers would favor low charging, but if they are unable to actuate the control systems to actually reduce those costs, they wouldn't be willing to deal with extra system designs or user interfaces that would complicate their charging day. Unfortunately, today, many charging apps request users to offer the departure time and energy needs. And as illustrated in findings from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, unfortunately, drivers who are faced with this text and user input opportunity only participated in 48% of the potential smart charging sessions, and this is in a public garage. Berkeley Lab concluded that even if someone participated, the energy needed provided by the users is not always correct, quote. A similar project in the National Renewable Energy Lab's garage in Golden shows in the center chart that the range of user errors in requesting energy via an app, where 74% of drivers providing responses provided information that exceeded the amount of energy that could actually be delivered to their car. In other words, they were asking for more energy than what was actually the balance of the state of charge in their electric vehicle. Thus, requests for a very full battery pack to account for potential uncertainties in travel schedules curtails the ability to manage EV load as a demand response resource. This is shown in the third curve on the right. This curve shows how load reduction potentials vary by time of day, given a parametric curve on the amounts of energy reserved in the battery. Here, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory concluded that a substantial amount of load reduction is possible, or 65% of a load drop from EV charging load, even if if half the battery is reserved to protect the customer's mobility in the case that they have an unexpected trip. So in all, while drivers want low costs, requiring user input, specifically high-level communication types of input with departure time and energy requirements, will complicate interactions and limit capacity management, highlighting the need to automate these communications wherever possible. I'll conclude with a few additional efforts that we are working on with our interagency partners, the Public Utilities Commission, the Air Resources Board, and the California ISO, Independent System Operator, toward vehicle grid integration in California. First, as I mentioned before, we're actively working on amending interconnection rules and grid codes to allow for alternating current EVs to offer vehicle to grid and act as distributed energy resources. In addition to the EVI Pro tool, we're also developing a medium and heavy-duty infrastructure projection tool, given regulations for heavy-duty trucks, transit, shuttles, vessels at berth, and other types of use cases necessary to reduce air pollution. We're actively trying to understand the impacts and benefits from pairing distributed generation and storage for charging in a way to reduce grid impact. In addition, we're also analyzing benefits to consumers, site hosts, and aggregators and utilities from conducting smart charging, and taking those potential benefits to potentially prioritize tariff and market reforms to enable distribution and wholesale services to be provided by EVs. And lastly, the Energy Commission is leading a multi-agency planning effort to update the vehicle grid integration roadmap, given the progress in our understanding of the state of technology and these parallel policy and technology efforts. So with that, I will end my presentation and I'm open to questions and look forward to the discussion. Thank you again, Miriam, for having me today and being willing to learn from California.
My pleasure, Noel. Thank you so much for this presentation packed of full, interesting points. I have several questions. Meanwhile, if the participants have questions, if they can just leave them in the chat. What I found really interesting towards your end of the presentation is that really we cannot assume that the users are willing and happy to give necessary information for smart charging. But also we cannot assume that they are going to give correct information. So the importance to automate things. From ISO 15118 talk, my understanding is that the state of charge is optional. So we might still be facing some issues if we don't find an alternative or if the car companies don't actually decide to provide this information. What do you think about that?
So I've heard that, yes, state of charge is optional, but energy request in kilowatt hours is a parameter that would be traded. And state of charge is actually unless you know exactly the model of the vehicle, a kind of partial proxy for the real energy the real information that you would need, which is the energy needed to fulfill the immediate next trip before a person is able to charge again. For example, if you're relying on the state of charge and your optimization target is to fill the kind of difference between one and the state of charge, you may be overcharging the electric vehicle. Whereas if you receive the energy needed, and that could be based on a, say, price preference, where you're doing arbitrage across multiple locations, or a renewable energy integration signal, the energy needed could be traded. And I understand that that would be a requirement in ISO 15118.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned, which was excellent to hear, that there are several automakers in California that made a public announcement on the plans to use ISO 15118. Is that for smart charging or for plug and charge? Or maybe if they decide to use plug and charge and it makes the smart charging use case easy to implement?
So I include links to the automaker comments, and I understand them to be implementing level 2 AC ISO 15118 beyond the, say, DC use case for plug and charge, with the intent to do smart charging in combination with existing telematics solutions. So those are, I believe, planning to be kind of complementary technologies.
Okay, so those announcements from those manufacturers are available to find, and also it is about smart charging.
Correct. You can see the comments linked in the 4 URLs on this page.
One interesting thing also you mentioned is your study on the costs, extra costs that you would add to the chargers. Is my understanding correct that if you go over 1,000 chargers, you're only really adding 5% to the cost to include high-level communication, so to implement ISO 15118, for example?
This is what my regression analyses, which are based on surveys of supply manufacturers, electrical circuit wholesalers, as well as a cost of goods sold analysis of one somewhat popular level 2 EVSE. So when combining that information on the designs of the transceiver implementations from Qualcomm or ST Microelectronics, yes, the change in cost over 1,000 units tends to be de minimis. However, again, I'll have to disclaim this assumption that it's very difficult to understand how many, for example, software engineering hours or electrical engineering hours it will take to actually integrate that chip into the board,
Okay.
And any ultimate supply chain impacts for this new product line.
And there's only two vendors that provide that chip containing ISO 15118?
To my knowledge, there are 3 vendors, but as Mark mentioned, there's Qualcomm, which is often implemented in combination with ARM, the microcontroller, ST Microelectronics, and then MStar. When asking MStar for information, they didn't respond to my request. So I know of at least 3 chip manufacturers that exist to implement this, HomePlug GreenPhi.
Great, thank you. We have a question on the vehicle-to-grid planning. I think the vehicle grid integration roadmap. The question is, what groups or agencies are working on the vehicle-to-grid planning, and is there any documentation available on their work? Please do keep in mind, Noel, that when I tried to access some of these documentations from outside the US, I was not able to.
Yeah, so the Energy Commission is taking the lead on updating the vehicle grid integration roadmap currently. And I can send you a link to our page. I understand that our page was undergoing some upgrades to accommodate Americans with Disabilities Act requirements. That may have been a reason, but it could also have been an international reason. And so if anyone is unable to access the pages, feel free to contact me, and I'll provide the material that we've been working on with the other agencies
and with the
stakeholders.
And I must say that even before we met, I just contacted you to ask for these documentations, and you did send them, so you do respond. Would you mind maybe adding the link to the slides that you're going to share?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, you also mentioned the market reform. Do you have a timeline? So in the UK, for example, it's the same. We're rethinking electricity markets. We're rethinking potential markets at distribution level. And the regulator is undergoing thinking. So we don't expect to see this anytime soon. How about in California?
So my colleagues at the CPUC, the Public Utilities Commission, which regulate investor-owned utilities investments in charging infrastructure, and their role in helping to build out this new load from a distribution planning standpoint, from an integration standpoint, from a tariff development standpoint, are all working on what is called a transportation electrification framework, pursuant to a law that was passed in 2015 that directed the utilities to develop programs and investments for charging infrastructure. Right now, that framework is intended to provide a more stable planning horizon for the electric utilities, potentially setting EV targets and charging infrastructure targets that will be informed by other work at other agencies like CARB with their regulatory efforts and our charging infrastructure analysis. I don't know to what extent there will be a grid services aspect to that, but I know rate design is an ongoing and important issue to allow for site hosts to manage their costs. And in order to do that, the chargers have to be responsive, and there also needs to be a clear economic signal for grid services. So one thing that we are undertaking at the Energy Commission to assist and complement that PUC effort is undertaking a update to our load management systems. There's a pending rulemaking that will focus on EVSE to some extent, but that's all I can say about that right now.
Okay, thank you. Mindful of your time, do you have still a couple of minutes, or do you have to go?
I have 3 minutes. Okay,
excellent. You mentioned the EV Pro tool. Compared to last week's presentation from Peter Bach-Andersen from Denmark, they did a study also on the requirement of charging infrastructure, and the results are very similar. Home and work are some of the location where most charging will happen, complemented by a network of fast chargers, but also this differentiation between travel pattern and housing type. My question is about the EV Pro tool. Is it available to use for regions outside the US?
Currently, I do not believe that it's designed for regions outside the United States. Okay. But there is an online version of the tool, a light version. I can update this with a link so that people can play with the tool. Essentially, it takes a population of EVs. And so I guess if you had to use it, I would think about a state or a region that is kind of similarly situated in terms of housing stock and housing type and travel patterns. And then choose that region as a proxy, because it takes the connector ratios and then scales it to a population of vehicles and lets you take options for maximizing EVMT or, for example. Yes, I'll add that as a link.
Thank you. Last question. If I want to have the top 3 regions in the US with electric vehicle adoption and work, California would come first. Who are number 2 and 3?
I think that New York's doing a great deal.
But you take the lead position.
And I guess for 3rd place, Washington and Oregon are also doing a great deal.
Excellent. Okay, so that's California, New York, and then Washington, Oregon. Excellent. It's 9 o'clock your time, Noel. I'd like to thank you so much for today and for all the information you shared, and I do hope we stay in touch.
All right. Thank you again very much, Miriam, for letting us share, and encourage anyone with questions to reach out.
Thank you. Bye.